Good afternoon. A little bit different background here. I've decided that the walls were closing in at home, so I have been setting up shop in my husband's conference room at his office. So I'm in even a smaller box than I was in my room at home, but it does make me focus and helps me get things done so that we can continue to be on track. All right. Finally, finishing the Constitution, we're moving on to the next topic. It's federalism. Now, federalism is something that we touched on when we went through the difference between the unitary, the confederate, the federal systems. And so I want to just go back and just make sure that we're all on the same page and that we have a basis of understanding what it is we're talking about with federalism. Um, First thing I want to point out is going back through those terminologies. Now, this slide helps us see that when we talked about power and authority, and we said that everyone has a sense of power or a level of power, it's the authority that's different from person to person. We notice that in our American history system and the way we formed to where we are today, that we have had different levels of authority in our government systems. And so the first one we talked about was the unitary system. Now, if you go back and you think about the unitary system here, that central government was Great Britain. And Great Britain was making the decisions for the colonies, and they were the ones who were making and enforcing the laws. Now remember, that's the definition of government: who's making and who's enforcing the laws. So under the unitary system, again, it was Great Britain making those decisions and passing down on the colonies their directives. Again, we know that at some point the colonists got a little frustrated. A lot of it had to do with their frustration with the ridiculous amount of taxes. And so with the Declaration of Independence and the war, they decided to shift their power and authority, and they went over to the Confederate system. So we see again, unitary system is the power is from the central governments to its subdivisions, but under the Confederate process, the subdivisions, which were now called those independent states, and I keep referring to them as their independent little countries, essentially what they were the ones who held the power and authority, and they made the decision how much power the central government had. And when we went back through and talked about the Articles of Confederation, we found a number of positives that came with the Articles of Confederation, but on the negative side, they had more cons on the Confederate side, and the biggest issue, as we've talked about, is the inability to tax and raise money to support a government, but it was also the central government's inability to control the larger population. Now, we did talk about how the articles, some people will say that they were failures. Some people say they were successful. I continue to be one of those people who believes that it was a successful system because it did keep the colonies, now the states, united in order to defeat the British. But when it came to revising the articles, because remember, that's why they went to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, is to revise the Articles of Confederation. And when they got to Philadelphia and they started talking about it, they made the decision they don't want to go back to a unitary system, and they knew that the Confederate system wasn't necessarily going to work. And, in discussion, somebody says, well, can we combine the two? Well, that's a great question, but federalism hadn't been tried by anyone. So which way do we lean? And so they decided that they were going to create a system where both the central government and its subdivisions, still the states, would hold certain powers and somehow make this work consistently with each other simultaneously. Again, nobody had tried it. So if it failed, so be it. If it was successful, well, that's what it was, and that's what we currently have. So essentially what their idea was let's create, whoa, that didn't work so well. Let's create a federal system, and we'll identify this as the federal system. Whoops, I told you this is gonna, the federal government. So we have this federal system here. And then they said, well, we don't want literally to lose our states, so let's do this state thing too. Hopefully it will somehow work. We don't know. And essentially they were almost touching at the beginning. We're going to see over time how that becomes a very different system. So we had the federal and the state governments both existing, but really not doing much overlap. And so the original federal system wasn't what we see it today. So if we go back and we look at two of the big names that had very distinct views on what federalism is, one is Hamilton. And anyone who's followed it or saw Hamilton or read anything, he was very much for the central government, the national level, to have more power. And his attitude was, it is really only the government in its center that can actually protect the rights of individuals. And he looked at the Constitution and he said, it's a guide. It's not perfect, but it is definitely a direction, and that there may need to be interpretations made with some of the vague language. And he prided himself on some of that vague language. So he believed that the Constitution needed to be interpreted quite liberally. It was up for interpretation. So with that, we have the side that believes that the central government is important. Well, we also know on the other side was Jefferson. And Jefferson and Hamilton didn't get along. They will maybe see eye to eye a little bit later, but nothing at this point. And Jefferson was basically Hamilton's opposite, where Hamilton said the federal system, the central government, should have more power. Jefferson, on the other side, argued that any government that's being created at that point was actually a government that was being taken out of what currently existed. And as it's pointed out here, the central government is a product, it's basically a treaty of the states. And so his argument was, we're under a system where the states control and have the power and authority. Therefore, any power that's given to the central government is released by the states, and the states should be able to continue to do their thing. They should not be have powers taken. They should be able to exist the same as they did prior to this constitutional convention. And another point that Hamilton was very, or excuse me, Jefferson was very certain about was that the Constitution lists individual rights. And in the limited amount of rights that are written in Articles 1 through 7, that it actually kind of restricts the individual. And that if there are rights written in for the government and protects and limits their power, it needs to be done so very strictly in how it is written in the document. He disagreed with Hamilton on that this was just a manual. He looked at this and said, the Constitution is the directions, and whatever the directions say, we have to follow them quite literally. So there is definitely some issues. Who's right, who's wrong at this point? Nobody's right or wrong because no one had ever tried this before. So what they were really looking at here is the national government, the federal government, was going to deal with the treaties, was going to deal with commerce, and anything that dealt with the trade. They were going to deal with the money issue, getting rid of the 15 forms of currency, a form of currency for each state, and create something that was universal. They would deal with issues of naturalization. So they were going to really stick to the bigger picture, things that were going to influence the entire country, which means that on the other side, this would be the states would deal with the local issues. And that's really not going to help me here. That anything that was not going to affect the entire country, the states would deal with that. And that was dealing with relationships, marriages, divorces. That was dealing with education. That was dealing with primitive nonetheless, but dealing with infrastructure. That's not spelled right. Let me see. Infrastructure. There, that's better. So that's the original federalism. And as we go through this module, and I do a few more of these lessons, we're going to see that at some point, this particular circle is going to start getting a little bit further over. And with that, they're going to start pulling some of these items more closely to the central government rather than the states. So with that just basic information, what you're going to be asked to do is you're going to look at a video that came out after Hurricane Katrina. And what you need to understand is that with a national emergency and national disaster, it becomes the question of who's responsible. And Hurricane Katrina was not by any means Bush's highlight of his career. In fact, a lot of people will say that was his downfall, and I don't know if he would even disagree with that. But the concern with Katrina was that the federal government, the states, and the local governments were not communicating. And there were serious issues that came out of that event. With that, I have a number of articles that I want you just to scan through. And a lot of people, both left and right side, are wondering, and some have already said most certainly, that the coronavirus is Trump's Katrina. And so you're going to read some articles. Some are from the left, some are from the right, some are straight down the middle. But you're going to, in watching the Katrina video first and then going through these articles, I'm going to have you submit a reflection of what you're seeing and how those two issues really help you understand federalism even just a little bit more, in how we have different levels of government. But when we're dealing with the people, all levels of government have to have some sort of connection and communication in order for us. Government's job is to protect us. And if nobody's taking responsibility, who loses in this are the people. So if you have questions, by all means, email me. Otherwise, my next video, I'll be talking a little bit more about different types of federalism, how it's changed over the years, and we will move forward from there. So, thank you, and until next time, stay safe.